Which sword is objectively better?
Bro, you can't be serious with that question. Everybody knows which one is best. The Katana sword, obviously. When you want to sit on the fence so hard, you start to feel a special connection to Vlad the Impaler. This one's perfect. A hybrid. I'm joking, of course. The only real answer is the Kriegsmesser.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not a European katana. Stop calling it that. Actually, I can't even blame you. When you see it, at first glance, you're like, oh, it's curved, it's single-edged, it's used with two hands, it's like a katana. Not really. When you actually look at it, construction, grip shape, guard shape, blade shape, blade geometry, it's all quite a bit different. And when you actually handle them, you feel the difference, and when you cut with them, maybe it doesn't seem that different. By the way, if at any time you see the blade sort of partially disappear, don't be alarmed, it's intentional. It's the magic enchantment that allows it to phase through other blades, so if the opponent tries to defend, you get them anyway. So, this is a response to a video by Cerberusarms about which is better, the longsword or the katana. A remarkably fair and in-depth analysis on the topic, I have to say. And also he gave me a shout out, thank you for that. Okay, trying not to look like a sweaty neckbeard while the video lights are roasting me.
To make things fair, I purchased the katana and longsword from the same manufacturer, Ronin.
If I look skeptical, I mean, Ronin is good. I've reviewed them before. It's not really a problem, but compared to an Albion, the historical accuracy is lacking quite a bit. But I really can't blame you for that, because those are like, if you order one of each, that's like $700 altogether or something like that. So, yeah.
But I can't help but notice a hint of resentment when it comes to these comparison videos. Not to mention the obvious bias Europeans have.
What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about. In the least. I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but believe it or not, I used to be a weeb as a teenager. I mean, weren't we all? Well, technically nobody was. I don't remember the term weeaboo being a thing 25 years ago. A better word would probably be Japanophile. You know, somebody who buys into the glorified idea of Japan as opposed to the barbaric, uncivilized West of the time. Like you point out in this video, it has had an enormous impact on pop culture. Katana this, katana that, anime, ninja movies, which, the 80s were full of. And anytime you see basically any kind of sword in a modern setting, at least in 80s and 90s movies, not quite so much anymore, but it always used to be a katana, almost never anything else. And yeah, of course that has left a mark. And there is a lot of fascination to it. This glorification of a sword that is probably a little bit more pronounced in Japanese culture. I would argue a little bit how far compared to European culture, but we'll get back to that. Either way, the whole idea that the sword embodies the soul of the samurai, and also how meticulous the making process is. There is just a whole aura of mysticism surrounding it.
Like Skall admits, many are just sick of hearing how overhyped katanas are. And a lot of them seem to take it personally.
Yeah, part of it has to do with being bombarded with misconceptions over and over again, and just seeing constantly ridiculous, bizarre claims about how a katana can just cut straight through a longsword blade and through buildings and whatever the hell, the sharpest thing ever made, etc., etc. But that happens with anything that gains a certain amount of followership. Let's put it that way. And the same way, the response to it, the knee-jerk reaction to it, is also always the same. Like, for example, if you think about anime in and of itself, of course it's related, but back when anime was like a really obscure thing where hardly anybody watched it, well, at least it was a very niche thing. there wasn't necessarily as much resistance to it, I would say. But as it's become more popular, the hate train has gained more and more compartments and picked up more and more speed. So now there are people who are like vehemently frothing at the mouth. Anime haters who, sort of by extension, also despise the katana and call anyone who likes katanas a weeb. I've seen it. Sadly, in the comment section of some of my own videos.
The katana had a massive impact on American pop culture. If you're a gun-toting, rootin', tootin', red-blooded American like me, chances are you fucking love katanas.
Katana's the most Murican thing in the short history of this country. No, I get what you mean. It's definitely had a significant impact, and yeah, arguably more so than in Europe, because, well, Europe has plenty of its own swords.
Growing up as an American, we didn't have a cultural sword of our own.
Which is kind of weird, because it really does. If you think about the Civil War, for example, and, you know, basically ever since the founding, there have been swords, sabers in particular, but for some reason sabers have never gained this sort of mysticism and awe-inspiring presence, or however you want to put it, which, you know, they very well could have, especially in the age of gunpowder. Isn't there something even more imposing, or maybe just plain crazy, about charging into battle with a saber when there's guns everywhere?
European swords were rarely romanticized in American movies.
In American movies, yes, I can agree with that. I would not agree that they were generally not romanticized, because they absolutely were. I mean, Excalibur. There have also been plenty of Hollywood productions of anything related to King Arthur and Excalibur and whatever. There are definitely some magical swords, and you have plenty of myths, obviously. Germanic and Viking legends about magic swords and this and that and the other. But yeah, from an American perspective, the katana probably dominated that whole field a little bit more.
If the longsword fighter is skilled enough, they could potentially stay out of kill range of the katana, all while still being able to strike at their opponent.
And you've seen a bunch of videos that I've made, particularly lately, where reach is a major advantage. You know, particularly if you have very short weapons like sickles, it's quite difficult to really get into your own reach. And some people have objected to that and disagree that it's that much of a disadvantage. The thing is, can you learn to deal with it better? Like, can you train yourself specifically in tactics and techniques against a longer weapon if you have the shorter one? Sure, yes. But that doesn't really make the disadvantage disappear. You compensate for it, but that doesn't mean that the shorter reach is not a disadvantage in and of itself. Of course, once you get to a certain distance, the length is actually a benefit to you, because then you can do more with a shorter blade, of course. But you still need to be able to get there. So I find that quite often, in order to get into your own reach, if you have a significantly shorter weapon, you need to be more skilled, because your weapon is at a disadvantage, and that's really all I'm saying in that regard. However, when it comes to longsword versus katana, it's not a dramatic difference. And also I think that quite often, if you wanted to really compare a little bit more fairly, I feel like a different type of Japanese sword is probably more appropriate. I often think of the tachi, although it can be very strongly curved, like a much more extreme curvature than a katana. But there are different types of katana. There are longer ones as well. So if you take a type with a blade length closer to a longsword, or simply you compare it to a shorter longsword, because there is a lot of difference and variation when it comes to longswords. It's quite a broad term, really. Then it's not really that big of a difference.
The blade is double-edged. The longsword allows for rapid follow-up attacks with the back of the blade, making it more unpredictable than the katana's single edge.
That is a point that I've often made myself. I don't really think that nowadays, I don't think it's that strong necessarily, simply because if you perform the same kind of strike with the spine, basically, it's still going to be effective. Like, it depends on the location, the hit location. Like, if you smash someone in the head with the spine of the blade, with a thwarting cut that you would normally use with the second edge, it's still going to have an effect, no doubt. At the very least, to allow for a follow-up. If you smash them with the spine and then come around for a true edge cut, yeah, that'll work. And it really only takes an adjustment of the wrist. I've shown that before. The difference between a thwart cut with the false edge and a cut with the true edge is pretty minimal. Yes, the thumb grip allows you to pull it in very tight, which lets you perform full powered cuts really up close at grappling distance, basically. But you can also do it with the true edge if you absolutely have to. It's not quite as effective in my experience, but it's not that you cannot use the spine of a single edge blade at all, or simply the true edge instead of the false edge.
The length of the sword generally makes it slower and less viable in close range combat than the katana.
At first, I was going to disagree with it, but it's a mild disagreement at best. I do think there's plenty that a longsword can do up close, particularly when you use half swording and all of that, and thumb grip, thwart cut, etc. Like I can basically cut my own leg if I wanted to for some reason, like this. So that's extremely up close. However, there are situations where a shorter blade will definitely allow you to get away more easily than a longer one, particularly if you're bound up. If your opponent's blade is in the way, you may be able to dip under more easily with a shorter blade as opposed to longer, simply because, well, there's less to maneuver around. And, close quarter cuts, particularly also with a curved blade, are going to be more effective. Slashes and draw cuts, things of that nature. At the same time, as said, longswords and Kriegsmessers have large guards and pommels, or pommel caps in this case, to strike with. Of course, you can also strike with the end of a katana handle. So I would agree generally. Like, I don't think the difference is enormous between the two. I would say yes, up close the katana has a slight advantage, and at distance the longsword has a slight advantage.
The shorter, lighter blade allows for lightning-fast strikes, but means the katana user will need to close the distance, which can be extremely dangerous.
I can't really object to that for the most part, although I think it's still worth reiterating how much variety there is with longswords. So you can have some that are very, very fast, and you can have some that are a little bit clunkier. This in particular right here, it's not one of the lightest two-handed European swords, but I find that I can swing it at pretty much the same speed as a katana for the most part. It's extremely well balanced and nimble, much more than you would expect. Now, of course, if this exact same sword had a shorter blade, you could maneuver it even faster, potentially. Also, you could draw it faster, and that's where the katana excels. The quick draw, defending yourself against surprise attacks, assassination attempts, who knows what. Quickly drawing and cutting in one motion. You can do that with a longsword too, but the katana is just more optimized for this purpose. A short single-handed messer was also excellent for civilian self-defense because it was easy to carry and quick to draw.
In my opinion, the biggest difference between these two swords is not their blades. It's their fighting style.
Absolutely. And even then, I've made a video about this topic just recently, talking about how Japanese and European swordsmanship are a lot more similar than many people seem to realize, where you can definitely recognize techniques from one when you've practiced the other. There are some differences, absolutely, but I would most certainly say that the similarities are greater than the differences. There's also a test cutting comparison in that video, which I always appreciate personally, because a lot of people skip the hands-on part. This was a pretty fair and reasonable test, and I've personally done test cutting with so many swords that at this point I can say, yeah, it just depends a lot on the individual design. I would generally say, particularly in the budget range and even still mid-range, katanas, like reproduction katanas on the market, typically cut better. They tend to just have much better edges and better blade profiles. This is a fault with a lot of budget and mid-range longsword manufacturers. In the high-end range, you don't encounter that problem, really. But if you're on a budget and you want to do cutting, then quite often you are better off with a katana, straight up. And it may be easier as well.
Oh my god! I overpowered that so much.
The katana is a pure DPS weapon through and through, while the longsword is a more balanced weapon meant for a tank.
That's a pretty good way to sum it up. A katana generally emphasizes offense over defense, for the most part. It's always debatable. You can argue about the nuances for hours, but I think that's a pretty fair general observation.
It's like comparing a 1911 to a Glock. Sure, there are clear advantages on the surface to the more modern
1911.
Glock.
Wait, what? Did you just say the Glock has an advantage over the 1911? How dare you? Just kidding, I'm more of an M&P guy myself. And of course, revolvers.
I personally gravitate more towards katanas because of my martial arts background, and growing up, I was a disgusting little weeb. Does that make a katana better than longsword? No. I'm not self-centered enough to think my preference as fact, and neither should you.
That is very mature.
So saying one is far superior to the other is like some kid on a playground saying their dad could beat up your dad, or that Xbox is better than PlayStation. It's completely foolish and generally rooted in childish bias. These swords are polar opposites.
I can't really agree with that. A polar opposite to me is something much more extreme, like say a mace compared to a small sword. That is literally polar opposite because the balance is pretty much flipped and the application is very different. The pros and cons are mirrors of one another. With longsword and katana, I mean, they're still pretty nimble, agile swords, mostly used with two hands, even though they can be used with a single hand as well. And they exceed at dueling more so than on the battlefield. Seems more like different flavors to me, which is why I tend to compare it to the whole Pepsi versus Coke thing. They're both fizzy drinks, even the same type of fizzy drinks, but they have slightly different flavors. Okay, maybe it's more fair to compare, say, cola to 7-Up or whatever, Mountain Dew, pick your poison. Either way. So once again, great video, check it out. I've linked it down below. So that was definitely a fun one to respond to. Hope you liked it. Let us know what you think in the comments, which better and why. Yeah, have a good one. Take care.